great to see everybody here after 2 years of lockdown and COVID. It's nice to be able to get to see old friends and colleagues again.
Firstly,
we are working our way.
That's another sort of energy sustainable technology that sort of is great but works against us. It also burns the grass in my yard.
we started, I'm not going to go through this, but we started, if you recall, with James Judith's report. The final one came out in May. The bit I wanted to pull out of that is what I'm sure you've all seen, purpose that a culture change is required to support the delivery of buildings that are safe both now and in the future. Now my concentration is going to be in the occupation part, and I was very pleased to hear Tim Galloway opening up this morning and talking about culture change and competence, which is where my focus has been over the last couple of years. In fact, my overview of all this new regime, and there's an awful lot to it, is that it's really about raising quality. There's quality in workmanship, quality in the people, quality in the documentation, quality in quality. And for that you need competence. You will know there's been a lot of work going on in competence. In order to try, the addition to competence, we're all very well aware, certainly in the UK, of skills, knowledge and experience. What has been missing, I think we will agree, is positive behaviours. So we've been working very, very hard to try and calculate behaviours which leads to the culture change. And a lot of the work we're doing at the moment is trying to work out how we can measure behavioural change. Because if we're going to have behavioural change, we're going to have PASs, which I'll come on to, which are standards and so on and so forth. We need to be able to measure all this to make sure that the people who claim to be competent are actually competent and are measured against each other. And I'll come to one or two of the things we've been on to. Again, you've read those. These are the outfall of Dame Judith, but it's not just her. I mean, I think the industry accepts most of this. Subsequent to Dame Judith, the industry response was to set up the ISSG, Industry Safety Steering Group, which was under the auspices of the CIC. There's a lot of acronyms. But the long and the short of it was we set up 11 working groups, of which I was chairing, as I say, Working Group 8. All of these were focused on trying to coordinate competence levels across the piece, across the whole built environment. So a lot of work, and there's an awful lot of people, an awful lot of organisations contributed to this. It's all been voluntary, and the output is coming through now. The output of all those working groups went into this, which is an enormous tome. Some of you may or may not have read it. Some of it's very technical and is of use, I would suggest, generally on a technical basis. Ours, Working Group 8, because ours was absolutely new, this concept from Dame Judith of having somebody responsible in occupation, we had an annex of our own, which ours was called Safer People, Safer Homes, Building Safety Management. Now, that indicates that long before the discussion about an individual building safety manager was touted about, that we always understood that building safety management in occupation is going to be best delivered by organisations. Now, they're going to need a competent person within that organisation, and the organisations are going to need resources as well as access to competent advice. So, right from the very beginning, Working Group 8 was looking at this on a holistic basis. In fact, we started off looking at what we call whole buildings, but it's very difficult to define a whole building. But you will recall that the Building Safety Act, which is the fundamental bit that we're talking about here, deals with spread of fire and structural safety in the residential part only of a building. That in itself is a complication, but it's not an unreasonable way of taking it, because of course we've got all the existing regulation that sits here. None of that's gone away. The Building Safety Act is in addition, and trying to tighten it all up, really. So The bottom slide there is talking about 8670, which has been mentioned by a couple of other speakers. That was the first one of these competence standards, and taken on by the British Standards Institute. And that sits right at the top of all of this. And the idea is that that is a standard framework, a competence framework for the whole built environment. So any discipline, any professional body, any trade body, anybody doing anything needs to map their competences so that all the bits and pieces required map to this singular thing. Excuse me. 8670 is aimed at individuals, because it's long been recognised, of course, that individuals, let's just say, in the industry across the piece, we've often checked the competence of organisations. That has often not gone as far as checking the individuals in those organisations are actually competent. So this was to deal with individuals, and we are now in discussion generally across the industry talking about 8670B, and it may not be B, but looking at organisations, because obviously that's the next stage. Our progress with deliberation, we spent a lot of time to work out what it was that Dame Judith was actually looking at. As I say, who was going to be the client? You know, what are the interactions with these people? What actually happens in existing situations? This was 2 or 3 years ago now, 3 or 4 years ago now. As I said, we were looking at whole buildings. That's difficult. Is St Pancras one building? For those who don't know, St Pancras is a whopping great, huge mixed-use railway station. And holistic safety. If we're going to do competent standards, do we focus solely on these new regulations we're looking at, spread of fire and structural, or do we integrate the whole lot with all the other disciplines that we need? Our decision, or our view, was it needs to be holistic. Because if you're going to manage a property safely and produce the feeling of safety for the residents and actually the fact of resident safety, then you're going to need to deal with all the things that are there. So the competence standards, competence expectations need to be at that level. And we've always taken that view. This is a little bit of an example of the transition. Right at the beginning, Dame Judith was saying there's one person who's got to be named responsible for it. That actually came out of Working Group 8's thing very, very quickly, because there aren't the people. We would no doubt train the people up over the few years, but it's unnecessary to have that level of input. So we then moved to having organisations, and then the Building Safety Bill. So those in the UK will probably know all about this, but it's the output that comes. But it has been a transition period. Dame Judith had this one person, one property attitude, which really stirred the debate. So it was a necessary point. But discussion within the industry and the stakeholders generally, and I mean stakeholders including residents, including insurers, including the regulation and so on, moved the debate on pretty quickly to organisations, and now where we are, what I'm going to tell you. Post-March, as we all know, the building safety manager role was dropped. Yeah? And that was in response, really, to recommendations from industry, pressure from residents worrying about costs, which we all know, and quite rightly. But the consequences is that the principal accountable person and the accountable person, the owner, the client in this circumstance, still has all his or her other duties. So that leaves them back with two options. You know, it's much wider way of going about their business and delivering their property safely to live in. But it also means that they've got to go out and find their own competence, for want of a better expression. Because there's an assumption, which is reasonable, I think, that many of the principal accountable people do not have the inbound. They're commercial people, or in buy-to-rent, or the, no, sorry, not buy-to-rent, RTMs. RMCs. RTMs and RMCs, where they have a board of people who are likely to be lay. They own the properties that they're in, and they run a board. It's a legal construct to operate that form of ownership of property. But it did not allow professional people to be appointed as directors, which left open to the directors of these boards, of these potentially small or middle-sized property companies being wide open to huge health and safety liabilities, of which they were not competent. And it doesn't mean to say they don't care, they don't do their very best, but they don't know the details that a professional property manager, facilities manager would actually deal with. These detailed bits have been overcome in the bill recently. So, significant competence required all the way through the construction period for fire risk assessment, and we've had discussions about that, and there'll be more about it, I'm sure. But there has been, prior to the work we've all been doing over the last few years, not much real clarity on the wider sense of the competence necessary in the holistic matter of operating a building in occupation, which is, of course, the longest period. So, the next stage was that by the time we'd written our report, which had a draft competence framework for management of safety in occupied buildings, we gave that to the BSI, and they were developing it as PAS 8673, which I'll talk to you about in just the next slide or two. So the first job is we gave them a draft based on the work of Working Group 8. They've worked it up into PAS language as opposed to our language. It was initiated in 21, and the PAS is due for delivery probably June or July, late June, early July this year, because it's been through a few iterations, which have been quite interesting, and I'll explain one or two of them. The second bit of working group, because that was our job done, theoretically, but I did not want to lose the cooperation, the enormous amount of expertise that was around the table. And actually, once we've done that, you still, as I say, we've got the competence, but somebody needs to test that competence. And there was nobody around to do that. So we formed something called the Building Safety Alliance. We held the first meeting the 15th of March last year. I was very pleased that the HSE, DULUC, and the Welsh Government come as observers, since they want to see what we're doing. We've got about 45 members, as it is at the moment, and we call them council. It's just simply a grouping at the moment of the big professional bodies, the big trade bodies, insurers, lawyers we've got involved, we've got some of the investors. But the intent is to use this grouping as a forum within the occupation across the whole lot, all these interests. So anybody in this room who's interested to be in that discussion forum, please come and see me after the event, yeah? But this is what I'm going to be talking to you about. We've launched it and we're going to start expanding it. As I said, the whole point of this is not for profit. We're trying to keep the independence of it, because if one, dare I say it, and I've got a lot of good friends and honourable people there are in professional bodies, but what we're trying, training places, but we're trying to keep the commerce out of it as much as possible. So when the people are being tested for competence, it's apples for apples. Because there has been a recognised situation that if there isn't that sort of overall control, for want of a better expression, or oversight, then there is a chance, I would just say politely, that we might have a race to the bottom with people wanting to get a ticket the cheapest and quickest way, and we're trying to avoid that. In fact, there aren't going to be many people who want to be registered as competent against this PAS, we don't think anyway, so it's probably not commercially viable, which then runs the risk, of course, of nobody wanting to do it. So the hope is that we'll deal with that anyway. So the evolution of the PAS. As I say, it started, the overarching committee is the competence in the built environment. That is a BSI committee right at the very top. I'm fortunate to be asked to be a member of that, and that is the BSI, and I would say the regulatory route for keeping an eye and keeping the coordination of competence within the whole built environment. Overarching competence framework 8670 I've spoken about, and we're looking now to do 867B, and these three, I was asked to chair 8673, sorry, not chair, I beg your pardon, I was the industry lead, I think. But they basically have an industry lead for each who's an expert in the thing, and there's a steering group of 15 of the great and the good who forge by way of consensus, and I can tell you that's been like herding cats for my one and the others, but by way of consensus to get to a PAS that people generally agree on. And it's not easy, to be honest, but we've got there on all three of them. And I believe that the Certainly the 8673 is now with the sponsor, which is Duluck, to go and have a look at it to see whether it fits their vision, for want of a better expression. A bit of an explanation of how it all sits. I'm not going to go long, but this is a BSI diagram that I did ask permission to use. But you can see how it all sits together, and the whole idea is these are competence frameworks. If in the construction or in these, you will take the framework and apply it to your business or your trade body or your professional body or your discipline. Yeah? So that's the structuring of it all. This is the tortuous route. So you start with a base document, which in our thing was the thing that in my group, and my experience was, oops, incident book, please, Mr. Bulmer. Yeah. Right, we'll carry on. So we start with the draft document. It gets turned into a base document for the PAS, and it goes to the steering group, and they pore through it until they come to draft one. Draft one then goes through a number of things, but it goes out to public consultation along the way. The public consultation that we had, I think, had 400, I think we had 300 comments from the steering group, which is the 20 of the great and the good, and another 400 or so from the public consultation, which on the one side gave us an awful lot of work, but on the other side did show that there's engagement. Some loved it, some hated it, some are in the middle, but as I say, it's consensus, says he with a grin. But anyway, we've got there. And along the way, we've had a number of things, and I was just going to go into the bit of the background of how we've got to where we've got to with it. The list. Some of those who know me will have heard me referring to this. Along the way of this, of course, you get to the point of what does the PAS cover? Now, are you going to deal with the new regulations only, or regulations plus, as we called it, which is all the existing regulations? So it's basically spread of fire and structural only, because that's 8673. Yeah, sorry, that is the Building Safety Act, which has spawned 8673. And there are a lot of people saying that's all the PAS should say. It should deal with the build to which it's related. Fortunately, and my preference was, and we used the list, and the list is effectively, having worked in property management for many years, I went back through my records and went to a number of other colleagues and people, and we drew up a list, and I think at the last count we're at about 280 odd line items, which are either documents, activities, actions, bits of paper, whatever it is, that you may need when you take on a new building. It's not to say every new building has every one of these line items, and some of them, let us say lifts, you might have dozens. But the point of it was to try and work out for the steering group, and indeed to help guidance and discussion with the regulation policymakers, to say, well, it's not just this. You've got to do all of these things to have a safe building. And somewhere along the line, you've got to draw a line to say which is in the bill and which is out of the bill.
Tall Building Fire Safety Network delivers high-quality safety management training for anyone involved in the fire risk management of high-rise or tall buildings. Recognised by the Institution of Fire Engineers, we've been delivering fire safety training since 2011, and many organisations rely on our training for gaining competence in this field. Sign up for our training courses and conferences in 2023.
And as you can imagine, that was an interesting discussion on all fronts. But that sits at the back, and it will come back at you. It's not in the PAS. It was working papers. But I think it'll come back due to some work we're starting now, which is a sort of the Haynes Guide to how to do all of this, which I'll come on to. But having decided that and worked this out, we then try to work out, well, if we know all these things we've got to do, that's A, going to guide the competence requirements, is it not? It's going to guide contractual arrangements, which I'll come back to. Because as an accountable person, you're going to employ an organisation to help you deliver your Part 4 duties. Or are you going to have just the Part 4 duties and everything else? So these contractual arrangements, I think, are going to be very important. And then, of course, it starts guiding us on what the golden thread, because if you're going to run a safe, healthy, happy, safe building for the residents, you're going to have all this managed somehow, but not under the Building Safety Act, necessarily. Yeah? So anyway, that was a bit of the background, which took probably 2 months to sort our way through. Coming out of that, these are within the paths. The words may be slightly different, but you get the essence of the sort of competence, the competence areas that we're looking for the organisations, or indeed an individual who is going to manage a building in occupation. Again, I'm not going to go through all of that. It's about, and it'll come out in final detail fairly soon. But it is bigger than a lot of people think when you actually settle down to deal with it. So we've now got a 8673, and the running title at the moment, yet to be published, the Built Environment Competence Requirements for the Management of Safety in Residential Buildings specification as a framework. Yeah. The project initiation, as I say, 4 steering groups. I've spoken a lot about this. The proposed publication, June and July. In April 22, so this last month, in particular, when the decision was made to remove the role of the building safety manager formally, because if that was going to be a formal role, we had to address that. But once that was removed, it opened up the opportunities for us to make this much more organisational. And quite obviously, if you've got an organisation running all this competence, etc., you need to have access to competent advice. So the competent advice you need will be in the PAS. It's a bit of a round robin, but we've managed, I think, to deliver a document that is more helpful than confusing. But you will be the judge of it when it comes out. Proposal of the Building Safety Alliance. I mentioned this before. So we now have the PAS. It's going to come out. And it will, in due time, probably a couple of years, go back into the mill for review, and it may well become a British standard. The 8673, the one right at the top, is already starting the British Standards Review. So that, you know, the writing's on the wall. So one of the things, as I said, we started this Building Safety Alliance to try and assist and listen to government, the policymakers, to mould all the conceptual stuff that we've been talking about, all of us have been talking about, into practicalities. Because the people out there actually managing these buildings or accepting the information, etc., need practical advice. The regulator's absolutely clear that they're not going to give us dozens of checklists. You know, the days of that's gone. The responsibility sits with the accountable person, this person who owns the building, to make sure that their building is safe for the residents. And they can go and buy the assistance and the help to get there, but the accountability remains. So when I come back to the contracts, those contract arrangements are going to be very critical. And I would suggest that those who are engaged in FM or property management and are, for instance, managing agents, but not only managing agents, need to look quite carefully at what they're doing, because there are different liabilities, but that's a completely separate subject I'm not going to go on to at the moment. But the idea of the Alliance is this, is to take a strategic approach. In the construction side, there are lots of, sorry, get back to my microphone just in case, but in the construction side, you've got loads and loads of, and in particular, let's say the Construction Industry Council, which is a representative body for the industry. We do not have a cross, unless anybody can tell me, and I'll be very pleased to hear it, but I haven't been able to identify, neither of anybody else, a cross-industry, cross-discipline forum for the inoccupied sector. Anyone got any ideas? Right the way across. There's lots of professional bodies, and they've got bits and pieces, but right the way across, there isn't one that I can find. So that's just what we're trying to build. And we want particular attention to residents, particular attention to FMs, particular attention to property managers, and I would like to believe that the regulation policymakers will stick with us, because that is the way all this is going to fall out, and we can work together to make it practical and actually get to the output, which is safe housing. So that is the plan for the Building Safety Alliance. as I said, lead, shepherd, and develop the cultural changes. Because the only way we're going to get any of this to change is get culture. And we've all spoken about it, but someone's actually got to do it. And that's what we're trying to do. And again, it's got to be consensual. You can't tell people to change their behaviour. It isn't going to work. I think we all know that. Certainly those in health and safety. You've got to pull people with you. Get them to buy into what you're trying to do. Forum for liaise with government, the safety regulators, and develop and oversee independent process. Because, as I've sort of mentioned, we're very keen to try and keep an independent process for certification for those who want to do it. So that is one of the jobs. But for those who are members of professional institutions, you will understand that there has to be a governance regime for stopping people who shouldn't be on it, or taking people off your registers, and that has legal liabilities and all the rest of it. So we've got a long way to go. And as I say, anybody who's interested in joining that forum, please come and tell me, because we're in the formation stage. We've been going a year, but we're still trying to form it. We have an entity called the Building Safety Alliance Limited. I am the interim chair of that. In fact, all the directors are interim, the whole point, and they had to sign up to step down when we have this formally done in a properly constituted, governed operation. Responsible codes of conduct complaints. You can imagine the governance that sits behind this, given that we're holding ourselves out as the arbiter of compliance and competence, is important. But the intention is to become the de facto source. Because as I mentioned before, I'm working with Andrew's team, FMs and others. We are looking to develop, in as shorter order as we can manage it, a Haynes guide. Ladybird book, I don't quite know which way to do it. Does everyone know about the Haynes guide? The guidance that if you're going to manage a residential property in occupation, this is the way you do it. But it's got to have the public sector input, it's got to have the private sector input, definitely the residents, definitely the governor. So we are scoping out how it's going to be done. And if we get all the constituent parts around the table in the first place, we'll have one set of guidance with all the stamps, and we all know what we should be doing. And I think that would be very helpful. And that's something that we in the Alliance are trying to push for, most certainly with Andrew's backing and assistance to get us there. The idea is going to be led by a stakeholder council, so it's not going to be a sort of grand duchy of elite at the top. The whole idea is it's owned by the people who are representing their people, for want of a better expression. But again, to do that legally is quite hard. We're working on it. Offer support to the PAPs, because again, there is not really anywhere for them to go, I don't think. For the accountable, the person who owns this building, he says, how the hell do I deal with all this? They've got to go somewhere. So we're hoping to give them a home to come to. But again, independence is so important. At the bottom is we're considering the issue of ID cards, because with all of this, you've got the tenants' engagement strategy. People will be, and the building managers, or whatever they are, will be visiting residents, rather like the gas man. You might need to have an ID card. The ID card might have on it how competent you are. Are you competent to run the shard, or competent to run a block of, let's say, 11 stories, or 18, or whatever it happens to be? So there's got to be levels as a progression, because it also should give us a progression for people that come into the business who are professionalised from the beginning, and we never get back to where we were. So, again, something to work for. Ambitious is all I can say. The new regime, I've got 5 minutes to get through that, have I? I have, look, you see. A mobile alarm clock. Principal accountable person, effect of the client. I'm not going to go in great depth. If anybody doesn't already know this, just perk up and I can speak to it. But in fact, it relates, don't forget the Building Safety Act, to seven stories or 18 metres, residential, or with more than 2 residential bits. Yeah? That's all this Act deals with. And if it's a mixed use, it doesn't relate, it's only the residential bit of mixed use. So the complications, because you'll have responsible people for the fire risk assessments down below, accountable people, buildings, there's an awful lot of players in this market, which comes onto the golden thread. As I say, forget the clauses, these are in the draft bill. All that's been taken out is the stuff from the building safety manager. So the accountable person has still got to do all this. because that is what's deemed required, necessary to provide safety. So we reckon there's 4 basic options, models for how to deal with this. These are not the only way of dealing with it, but we're talking about having people who have competence in the middle. Because if you are an organisation, and let us say, you know, the big organisations are doing this all very well. Certainly in the public sector, you know, local housing will have the fellow in charge of, or the lady in charge of fire, lady in charge of asbestos, somebody else responsible for water, etc., etc. But somebody has got to sit on the top of them. And my experience, I would say, in many of these organisations, that is a manager, is not somebody who knows what these people are actually doing, and that's the culture change we're trying to push. Yeah. Requirement is you've got to register it. And once you've been registered, you'll be asked to apply for the building assessment certificate, which leads you into requiring all these things, which is the safety case, the competence status. Have you actually discovered and can you evidence the work that you've done to make sure the people you're employing to do all this are competent, which is the same in the construction. It's not unlike CDM, unsurprisingly. Excuse me. An engagement strategy for the residents. That is much more than a lot of people are thinking, in my view. It is a requirement to engage with residents. As we heard very clearly, the lady at the last speaking was saying, nobody listens. You know, we get stuff foisted on us. We report faults and nobody hears. So the point of this engagement, it's not just an issue of document and access to all the information, it's engaging with them, so we hear what they're talking about. And I would just point at the bottom, you know, I think we're working around 13,500 HRBs, something around that is a sort of working figure. Nobody really knows. So in order to get your building assessment certificate, you've got to put in a safety case report, and the regulator's got to have a look at it, check it, etc., etc., etc. They're not going to be able to do that overnight. So there's going to be a rolling programme of the regulator hauling in the safety cases, safety case reports. And that's got to be done on a prioritised basis. So the higher risk. So we've now got to decide, how do we decide higher risk? My view is actually the brigades will know which are the better ones and the not so good ones in their borough, and they are part of the regulator. So I would suspect the prioritisation will probably come via the brigade, but it's not guaranteed, and that's just that's a personal opinion. So I've talked about appointments. Does the client want you to do regulations only, as in the regulations under the Building Safety Act, but you've also got the Fire Safety Act, you've got the Health and Safety at Work Act. What are you actually being required to do? Because your liabilities are slightly different. And you need to be clear. And if you're subcontracting, you need to be just as clear. And you need to make sure that they are competent too. The golden thread. When we get there, and you've got a discussion on this straight after me, so I'm not going to dwell on this at all, but fundamentally this collection of information is going to come through from construction. A subset of that will be the safety case relevant to your particular building for resident safety. Yeah? And then you've got to turn, and you're going to need to be able to provide that, certain elements of it, to various different people. And it's got to be digital. That is being formulated at the moment. I'm privy to some information about that. Further guidance is coming out fairly soon about building risk assessment and what have you. Now, this is purely a model to try and illustrate. If this is all construction, it feeds into here, which is your sort of occupation stage. Across the top there, you've got these assets. Let us say it's a fire alarm at the top there. You need to know where it is, who made it, what's the O&M, what's the SSG 20 on the maintenance regime, and then the events bit on the right-hand side needs to log that information against that particular fire alarm. So who's tested it, when did they test it, are they competent to test it, etc., etc. And this is the sort of thing we're talking about. In order to do that, you need a safety management system. Now, no one's going to define what that means, but it's an assurance system, effectively. We just illustrated one there as Plan, Do, Check, Act. You'll all be aware of those. So you're going to need to show the regulator that you know what you're doing and you can evidence it. And that's a management system of one form or another. Building risk assessment. This, we spoke about it earlier. The concepts of these come from high-risk industries, so it's not new to risk assessors, but it's pretty new to the property market. Guidance is coming out on that, but the point of this is to consider how a threat risk may occur and how it could escalate, and this is written into the Act. You know, you've got to have mitigation, you've got to understand what your risks are, you've got to understand how you're going to mitigate and manage them, and if it gets out of that compartment and escalates, how are you going to mitigate the thing when it started? And that is a bit of a different attitude, and takes some thinking about. Hazard, some will know of it, some won't. This is what's coming, this is going to be the record. It's not the only way, it's a slightly different way of looking at Swiss cheese, for those who know about that. By way of illustration, if you look at a building, it could come by all sorts of things, fire, and it could have all sorts of consequences. But we're talking about this sort of detail to understand your building risks. And the accountable person, the owner, is supposed to be involved in this because they're responsible. And the regulator has promised us that he will call them to account to make sure they do understand it. Safety case report, just to understand the difference. The safety case is the sort of documents and all the official stuff. The safety case report is a summary of that. It is literally a sort of 30-page letter to the regulator. I know what my building's made of. I know who lives in it. I know all the systems that are in it. This is my management system for making sure all of the above works. And by the by, I tell you, this is my case to you, regulator, that this building is safe to occupy. Yeah? And there'll be cross-references back to all the information you're going to be talking about in the next session. Now, my understanding is, as I said, that they can't do all of these immediately, but they will expect 100% enforcement, and there'll be a 5-year cycle for every HRB, every safety case report to go around every 5 years, at least. Residents' engagement I've spoken of. Duties on residents, it's basically, very simply, don't interfere with fire alarms and fire sprinkler systems and things. A little bit about complaints procedures, we've got to have that in place. I would suggest that everybody links into CROSS. They have some very interesting across business, across industry reports. Insurance. We're all talking about that. I'm not going to get into that now, but I would suggest that competence is going to go an awful long way to proving to your insurers you know what you're talking about. Thank you for listening. I'm nearly there.